Okay. This is Tom Edmondson for meaningandministry.com, and I'm today happy to invite for your attention Reverend Dr. Roger Kruger, who is going to share with us about his book, The Proper Care of Snakes, Managing Personality Disorders in Congregational Settings. I am, there we go, going to share. There's the book cover for you. And a little bio here. Roger Kruger is a retired pastoral counselor where his primary clientele consisted of professional church workers and their families. He's a graduate of Concordia Seminary in St. Louis and has served congregations in Arkansas and Colorado, as well as going on from there to do clinical training and earn a Doctor of Ministry in Pastoral Counseling from the Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. Uh, Frequent presenter at conferences and writer of articles and so forth. And today, of course, we are so delighted to talk about your book, The Proper Care and Feeding of Snakes. So let's get right on into it.
All right.
There are things in seminary, or the things that we always feel like we didn't learn in seminary that we needed in the ministry, specifically in this case, how to recognize people, or not, I don't want to say people, but personality disorders, toxic behaviors, and so forth. So obviously, you wrote this book to address some of that. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book?
Well, you're absolutely correct. We did learn the seminary I went to, we almost had no information about psychology at all, much less really about personality disorders. I was pretty much an academic back then. I really enjoyed the Greek and doing study of the Bible, and I really enjoyed that, was good at it. Um, I did take one counseling course, and back then it was Rogerian psychology, where somebody comes in and says, "Oh, I'm not feeling good today," and you say, "You're not feeling good today," and they say, "Yeah, my dog died," and you say, "Yeah, your dog died," and et cetera, et cetera. You just repeat back what they said. I thought
Yes.
this was really stupid. If somebody came in and started doing that with me, I'd leave and never come back.
Yes.
So that was my introduction to counseling, and I had no interest at all in counseling after that. Um, so I kind of came at it backwards. It was when I was serving in my third call. I'd been there about 10 years. I was feeling kind of stuck. Um, you know, you know, things weren't going like I wanted it to go, and I'd been there a long time and not really developing anything new. And so I was looking around for something to broaden my horizons and ended up taking a unit of CPE, clinical pastoral education, just because it was available. It wasn't anything I was really interested in. In fact, I approached it with some hesitation, but it turned out to be a really life-changing experience for me. I really got excited about learning more about myself, how other people reacted to me, learning better how to be a better listener, and all that was really good. And one day while I was there at the hospital, they had a little room where we'd meet, and they had maybe half a dozen books there. And one of them was the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's the book that you use to give a diagnosis to submit to insurance claims. So I was just kind of paging through, just curious what kind of mental health disorders there were out there, and happened to run across a description of borderline personality disorder.
Right.
And it fit exactly to a T. An individual in my congregation was creating continual havoc. And I was thinking, why didn't I never know this before? It would have been so helpful to know there's actually a name for this. It means it's not, I'm not dealing with this all by myself. There's been a lot of people who have dealt with this before, and it's a recognizable trait, and there's a ways to do manage this, a way to work with that. And so that was my first insight into that learning more about personality disorders could be helpful. Um, it went on from there. It wasn't an instant change where I started writing this book about personality disorders. I got my degree in pastoral counseling and psychotherapy, and after a year, couple of years actually of just doing general counseling, the opportunity came up with Lutheran Family Services in Nebraska to head up a program called Partners in Caring. It was specifically designed to provide care for professional church workers. So I would give counseling, provide counseling to pastors and their family members, but also felt important to do more of the preventative kinds of things. And so we would do retreats, we did seminars, we did a variety of things to hopefully to build more healthy pastors and their relationships with people. It was in that process that, finally dawned on me that it would really be helpful for pastors to know what I learned the hard way, that there are actually descriptions of personality disorders. And so I wrote this book. And again, the importance is not how you cure these personality disorders. According to the APA, the Psychological Association that writes these diagnostic and statistical manuals, they estimate, how many people out of 100 that you'd have in each category. And I counted them up as something like 15 and a half to 16 people out of 100
Wow.
that you're going to have in your congregation. And
Yes,
that's general population. And
right.
my guess is because congregations welcome people with open arms, that the
Mhm.
number is even higher than that within congregations. So I think it's a really important subject for pastors to become more aware of and better able to work with and to handle, not to cure, but just to develop awareness of and find better ways to manage these individuals in their congregations. And they're not all negative examples. I mean, sometimes you think you're helping a person when you're really not helping them. And that's part of understanding personality disorders also.
Yes. Well, I have to tell you, I relate a lot to everything you said, including, in undergrad, I learned some Rogerian person-centered counseling, and it just seems a little bit nonsensical to me as well, and I
I
continue
mean,
to
there's a point to it. I mean, it teaches
this.
you to listen, it teaches you to mirror the feedback the person
Yes,
so that they come up with the answers themselves. And that's all valuable, but the way it's practiced is kind of nonsensical.
yes, and of course, you kind of already answered my next question, but I don't know if you want to add anything to it, but I did prepare a question about, from your biography that you had served a number of churches and then you went back for this. And so I was going to ask if maybe the move towards clinical pastoral care, clinical psychology, or psychotherapy was for you motivated by issues that you had experienced as a pastor. And my sense of what you told me already is kind of yes and kind of no.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to respond to that. Um, I served three different calls in parish ministries, and each call was very different. Right out of seminary, it was a dual parish, basically rural congregations in Arkansas. Um, so it was almost like a foreign mission in some ways. It was a very, very different culture than I grew up in. Um, then I served a congregation in Colorado that was just up in the mountains that was growing rapidly. I mean, people were moving there from all over. And so, uh, you just had to welcome people that kept coming through the doors. You didn't have to hunt for them at all. And then the third one was in an urban congregation, it's a mother church in the area, very traditional. They didn't even like banners because that detracted from their beautiful church. Um, and so I found out that different things worked in different places. You can't do the same thing. You have to adapt to the congregation that you're called to serve. So that was a part of the background, just understanding differences of congregations. And um, yeah, and as I said, I did general counseling for a couple of years when the opportunity came up to become head of this program called Partners in Caring. And it just seemed to me like, wow, this is the way God's been leading me all this time. I've got this experience now on dealing with all different kinds of congregations. and I now got some clinical training on how to work with pastors, and so it just all fit together for me. And I felt blessed to be in that position where I can finally put all that different experience to work.
Well, that works for me as well. And I have to say that I found your book probably because I was looking for something that you talk about in the book and something that I was experiencing that is the same kind of yearning or the need for information that you talked about. Um, Over the years, especially my as I experienced my middle age years of ministry, Matthew 10:16 has become very important to me, which reads, Jesus says, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves, therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. And boy, I think I apply more and more to ministry as I experience more. Um, can you talk a little bit about how you advise ministers to be caring and hospitable without being taken advantage of?
Yeah, that's an important question. I think generally, not always, but I think a majority of pastors enter ministry with an attitude where I'm a dove. You know, I go in to love people, and if I love people, they're going to love me back. And that doesn't always work. It doesn't always work. There are a few that are on the other end of the spectrum who go in, I know all the answers, and I am the serpent with all the wisdom, and you better follow me. And there is no real compassion there. So I think Jesus, in a rather unique way, puts those two together in terms of what it takes to be an effective pastor.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like when I survey the literature, or at least I go on Amazon and I'm looking for ministry related books on these kinds of topics. Most of them are geared towards the church that does harm to the parishioners, the pastor who's a narcissist or leadership who does harm. There doesn't seem to be a lot of books like yours that help us on our end. But I always argue that a church is a soft target, and a lot of times people who have problem personalities look for those opportunities to come in. And I don't know, are they doing it intentionally, or is it just part of their nature, or some kind of combination of the all of the above?
Well, it's probably a combination, but again, I think it's because churches have very loose boundaries. We don't require them to go through any personality evaluation before they join our congregation. And so a lot of people that would not be accepted in other places, they may not be able to hold down a job. They may get into all kinds of troubles elsewhere, but in a congregation, they're welcomed. And so that's where they end up. Now, there had been a couple of books back in the 60s, probably, that kind of demonized parishioners from that perspective. First, one was called Antagonist in the Church by Ken Houck.
I see.
And then Redinger took it a step further and called them clergy killers.
Oh, wow.
Um, and those, I mean, they're describing situations that are real. Don't deny that they happen. But I think more is needed than just labeling people and saying they're evil or they're an antagonist. It's a matter of understanding them and knowing how you have to adapt to work with them.
So along that line, then you use the word snake, and I'm perfectly comfortable with that. But I assume that there are people who take exception to that term.
Yes, indeed. I've ran into criticisms about the title that I'm labeling people also as snakes because we all have a natural dislike of snakes. I don't like snakes, actually. Uh, but it seemed to me to be very fitting. Um, the ability to handle snakes is about knowing what snakes are like and knowing that there are different kinds of snakes.
Yes.
Um, for a long time in life, I knew almost nothing about birds. I knew a robin and a sparrow and a blue jay, and that was about it. Um, then we got a bird feeder, and I started getting interested, and then found out each bird has unique habits, unique ways of going about it. Some feed on the ground, some eat from the food tray, some take one little seed and take it up to the tree and eat it, and then come back for another one. They're all unique about how they go about it. And I think that's what I'm trying to say by care of snakes. It's knowing personality disorders are predictable because that's almost a definition of what a personality is. They have one way of dealing with life. They it's pervasive. It's throughout their life. Most likely they're not going to change. But what a wonderful thing to know. Now I know what you're like. Now I know what you're going to do. Because it's not about getting you to change. I've got to adapt the way I work with you because I can change. I don't always have to do things the same way. And so to me, it became the perfect analogy for what I was talking about when dealing with personality disorders. And interesting, in some cultures, many of the older cultures, snake handlers were the religious people,
Right.
going back to Moses and Pharaoh's religious people in Egypt and their snake handling. They were regarded as having a higher power because they understood snakes. They
Yes.
knew how to handle them, and that gave them a certain power.
And that you remind me of my Greek from years ago that the word pharmakon in Greek means both cure and poison. And so there's
Yeah,
always that
yeah,
balance. And not all snakes are poisonous.
right, exactly.
And yeah, that's a
Some are
very
good, right.
yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, I was going to highlight the what you already did though, the use of the word managing in your title, which I think is so appropriate. Even when people sometimes talk about conflict resolution, and I love the sound of that term, but a lot of times conflicts cannot be resolved; they just have to be managed. Conflict management,
Right.
and
Exactly.
so
Exactly.
um, how then, because I imagine that, we ministers are notorious for reading a book on a subject, let's say your book, and then thinking, okay, this is it. So I'm going to diagnose everybody in my congregation, as one of these things. And so I'm assuming that not everybody in the congregation has a personality disorder. And so how do we learn to sort of mo mitigate that and distinguish between a personality problem and a problem situation, perhaps, that is a person versus a situation?
Yeah, for one thing, all of these personalities just exist on a kind of continuum. I mean, so I just on a scale of 1 to 10, say a narcissistic personality disorder, it's probably like when they're only up to 8, 9, or 10 that they actually are a disorder. But you may have trend in that direction when you have lesser characteristics of that. So it's not a fixed state at all. It's somewhere along a continuum where some have it very strongly and some less so. Um, and they don't come with labels, and I don't even like using labels unless it's for cure
Mhm.
or for care. I know I probably shouldn't use the word cure, but we're not calling people names by talking about personality disorder. We're talking about understanding some of their characteristics that give me some wisdom in terms of how best to deal with this situation. So typically, it's not going to be instantaneous that you recognize this, but it's a pattern. When you start seeing the same pattern happen again and again, then you need to think about, well, is this a personality disorder that's creating because the same thing keeps happening and doesn't change at all. Uh,
Yes.
and so then, you sometimes learn from talking to other people about have you seen this before, or just by your own observations, you notice how the same thing happens with the same person. over and over again.
Yes.
And then that gives you some insight that you're dealing with a personality disorder, not just a situation within the congregation.
You just reminded me too. I've been involved in a project called the Church Narrative Project, which our denomination is working
Hmm.
on, and it's based in part on narrative therapy.
Hmm.
Um, and so, what is interesting to me is that one of the, in logotherapy, uh, we have a plan of care. We might say step one is separate the person from the problem. And in narrative therapy, the one presentation regarding churches, they use the phrase, the people are not the problem is the problem. And so I'm thinking about that because, we want to say, no, the person is the problem, but in a sense, they're not,
Right,
right? Does
right,
that make sense?
right. Yeah. Well, and within the congregation, yeah, because they affect the people around them, and that's what creates the problem. Right. So, and you're not going to change the person because they are who they are.
Yeah.
So you got to look at what's happening around them. And this may get a little further off topic than meant to go with the subject, but just had an interesting conversation this morning with an individual. I just met this woman, and she asked what I did, and I was explaining that I was what I was going to do today. And I said, well, I'm going to give a little talk about personality disorders. Anyway, she went on to describe how her husband is depressive personality disorder. Um, and he just got this doom and gloom that hangs around him all the time. And and now he's lost his job, and now so he went off to Las Vegas.
Yeah.
Well, as the book talks about, you get caught up in these drama situations. A depressive person is automatically going to try to bring in somebody to make you feel better. So you try to cheer them up, and that's what she did in the first years of her marriage, try to cheer her up. And now he's acting out in a way where she wants her to become really down on him and say, what you're doing is wrong. But that's not going to help it either. What you do is withdraw from that play altogether. You're not going to play that game anymore.
Right.
You step aside from it. And that's the key in dealing with personality disorders. You don't become part of their play. You step outside of it. Um, saw a tape once of Edmund Friedman, family systems therapist in a therapy session. Where he was meeting with a couple and they were arguing about this and that, and he would interject, "Well, do you like Cheerios?" Talk about being off the wall, but that was his point. I'm not going to get caught up in your argument. You're not going to get me on your side. You
Mhm.
know, I'm going to step outside of this so we can take a step back from this and see what's going on, and maybe there we can make some progress. Because when you become part of that play, then nothing's going to change. You're going to be
Yes.
playing that cycle again.
And I think maybe this is where the pastor comes in a bit as therapist for the whole, in
Yeah,
that if the person with the personality disorder and the behavior continues to affect the people around them and it's not addressed in some way, then
right,
it sort of just plays
right,
havoc with the situation.
exactly, exactly.
So would you suggest that most all pastors go back to seminary and get clinical psychological training? Because I certainly think it's worthwhile.
Yeah, I would certainly think it's worthwhile too, but a lot of times you have to be in parish ministry before you realize how
Yeah,
much
that's
you
right.
need, you know. So you teach that ahead of time. People are like, oh,
Yeah.
I need it. But
That's absolutely true, and I do appreciate that. So it's kind of like once you're in the ministry and you think about all the kinds of skills you need to have. Of course, I guess most of us are jacks of all trades and master of none, but times it feels like you're trying to swallow or take a drink from a fire hydrant. It's just like so much. It
yeah,
can be overwhelming.
all right.
Um, So, are there warning signs then that a pastor can pick up on when meeting a potential member or having, let me make sure I read my question right. I knew I messed up somewhere. Yeah, meeting new people and potential church members. What kind of things can they pick up on, or is that even possible?
Well, I don't think it's, again, people don't come with their personality disorder labeled across their chest, um, and I think you have to see a pattern of behavior, and that doesn't happen at once. So it's more about listening and then observing uh, how often it happens. Now, sometimes you can learn from previous pastors or from members of the board, what's happened in the past, learn some of that church history on your congregation. That can give you some clues because definitely patterns do repeat. I was struck by the fact that uh, a fairly large number of congregations in which there's been sexual acting out on the part of the pastor happens more than once. I mean, that just kind of blew my mind. And you think your congregation through that went through it once, it'd never happen again.
I
But
see.
it happens two times, three times in the same
Wow.
congregation because there are some dynamics there that have never been addressed.
Interesting. You should mention that. So there was a pastor here at this congregation, um, 2016, I guess. No, sorry, 2006. 2016 is when I came, so I don't need to make that association, but around 2006 who had an affair and it, kind of really tore things up. As far as I know, there hasn't been any of that repeated since then. But certainly that kind of behavior gets into the DNA of the congregation, doesn't it? It has a
Yes, it does.
long-term effect and it has to
That's
be.
yeah, that's an extreme example, but that things that happened in the past become part of the congregation's DNA.
Yes.
Right.
So I've always felt like even though it was a decade later, that the interim between that minister and myself, was a time of turmoil and decline in this congregation. And so um, part of I think what I've needed to do is, without necessarily addressing that issue, but somehow be sensitive to it and try to be aware of how that has guided and molded people's decision making, or even the way they trust or don't trust me as a pastor.
Absolutely. It's become a
Yeah.
big part of it. Right.
I appreciate that insight very much. Once bitten, uh, once a pastor has stepped in it, or whatever you want to say, we have um, had to deal with somebody with, or several somebodies with personality issues. Perhaps we made a mistake, or we got caught in a trap, we got bit, as your illustration goes. How can we reestablish a proper relationship after the fact with those people and so on?
Well, none of us are perfect, and we all make missteps. Um, and that's a good thing about a personality disorder. They're going to give you a second chance because it's
Mm.
going to happen again. You know, so you learn from it. You learn what didn't work, and you adjust, you adapt. And again, the very thing that a person with a personality disorder can't do. They'll keep doing the same thing. But hopefully, as pastors with a healthy outlook, with some training, we are able to adapt. We can become different people in different situations, and that's what you do. You learn from what happened, and you try something different.
And in the book, you give great examples for each of the different personality disorders and how the pastor can respond to those people in those situations to be more productive, or at least to kind of manage them. And so
Right.
that's a very useful. Uh, I mean, the whole book is great. I've read it twice, and we'll read it again, no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
But that was very helpful to me, and
Appreciate it. Yeah,
I hope.
and all those examples are real. I used a group of interim pastors who have been in a lot of different congregations, and they provided a number of those illustrations for me. So yeah, they're real examples.
Yeah, all right. They certainly resonated with me. Um, so Guess I want to kind of, if I may, just briefly, and you tell me if I go a little too far. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to relate a little bit of what we've talked about and what you write in your book, a little bit to logotherapy, and a couple of things come to mind. Um, First of all, you talk about sort of patterns of behavior that are ingrained in people. They have a personality disorder. They don't know how to necessarily do act differently. And so that's not the same thing as psychosis, such as being bipolar or schizophrenic or so forth. And I don't know that personality disorders are addressed much in logotherapy. But I would like to say that I'm intrigued, and you can just tell me if this is too far off, but um, Frankl talked about how someone who is experiencing a psychosis, say they're bipolar, they're schizophrenic, or whatever, it doesn't keep them from being spiritual people. It doesn't even preclude them from being spiritual people. I loved the premise of his book, which in English is titled Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning, in which he says that there is in every human being uh, a spiritual core. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, a spiritual core that cannot be denied, even in the case of a psychosis. And one of the great examples he uses is Joan of Arc. And with Joan of Arc, he says, to a psychiatrist or whomever, she may simply be a schizophrenic, but it doesn't change the fact that she was also a saint. And there's a lot more to that argument, of course, than what I've described here. But is there some kind of a similarity when we're talking about people who have personality that there still is a core, a human spiritual core beneath that personality issue that can be activated or appealed to in a situation where maybe they're causing trouble and they need to see things differently. I hope that makes sense because in my mind it does, but I don't know if I'm making a lot of sense otherwise.
Yeah, if I understand you, no question about the fact
Yeah.
that I mean, it's interesting these people are attracted to congregations. Um, it's because it's their soul that's
Hmm.
searching for something. And by no means would we say if you don't have a soul or God doesn't love you, or I mean, these are the very people that God loves. And that's why it's important to manage them, to understand them in such a way that their hurtful side or their inadequate side is not getting in the way of the spiritual care that they receive. I like the German word, Seelsorge, the care of the soul. I mean, that's a beautiful way to describe what a pastor is. I think it's even better than that shepherd analogy that we use in English. Um, in, uh, and certainly the Seelsorge applies to people with personality disorders. It's part of your care for them. And managing it doesn't mean that you are just simply labeling them or putting them in a box. It's a matter of putting them in situations where they can best exhibit their image of God within the relationship with the congregation.
Nicely done. And you may or may not know this, but I think Viktor Frankl's book, he's actually his first book that he wrote that was destroyed by the Nazis. He had to rewrite it later. In German, the title, my German's not great, but it's Ärztliche Seelsorge, or Medical Ministry is the English title. But even that translation he took issue with because he wasn't trying to be religious per se. But, for him as a neurologist which means, of course, he was a medical doctor and a psychiatrist, um, he always argued that if, as an example, a surgeon has to save one's life by amputating a leg, there is the very clear fact that the surgeon could simply say, it's your leg or your life. I'm going to cut off your leg and I've done my job and I'll be on my way. Here's your bill. But for Frankel, that was not enough. The, it doesn't speak to the person's spirit. It doesn't speak to how do I resume life without a leg, you know. And
Mhm.
resilience is a byproduct of that, of course. But you know, somebody can lose a leg and they can be depressed. My life is over. I'm not whole. Or they can get a prosthetic and they can go and run in a marathon or whatever. So even Frankl used that word Seelsorge to describe, you know, a proper medical approach to the patient. So I think
Yeah.
that's why that I find logotherapy so appealing is that, you know, it's a very spiritual approach, even if you know, defined it in medical terms and philosophical terms. Uh, I find it quite easily adaptable to what I do. And
Mhm.
yeah, very much so. Um, well, we have kind of gone through all of my questions here, but I always like to kind of give my guest the opportunity to say, here's a question that I wish someone would ask me and they never have. Is there any such question that you have?
Wow.
Yeah, it's usually a stumper, unless you had something in your mind already.
Um, Nothing comes immediately to mind. I just want to add, though, in working with clergy, how important it is to have a resource that you work with. When I did my clinical training, that's something that really struck me. You know, once you get out of seminary, you think, I got it all. I don't need anybody else, you know.
Hmm.
And that's not true among doctors. They all have supervisors.
Yes.
Therapists all have supervisors
Mhm.
because these people are extremely valuable. They enable you to see what you're not seeing yourself.
Yes.
So whether it's a counselor, whether it's a good friend who's able to criticize you, whatever, it's important to have that person that you can really open up to and will know you and will care for you, but will also give you good advice and enable you
Yes.
to see the things about yourself you're not seeing.
Very, very well stated. A support system,
Yeah.
accountability, and so forth. Yes.
Uh,
That's wonderful advice. And you also made me think about the fact that, you know, even though I've uh, been trained in logotherapy, Bowen family, and a little bit of narrative therapy and so forth, I actually don't do therapy with my congregation. I do meet sometimes with individuals, um, and I will meet with, you know, a couple. I will meet with a family as their pastor, but I will not engage in therapy or counseling with them. I always refer them. And maybe this is a good final question then is, you know, how do you advise or how would you advise someone like myself? I'm the pastor of a small congregation. We run in the 50s and 60s on Sundays. We probably have 80, 80 people more or less on the roll. And so trying to be their counselor is, or their therapist is asking too much. So what then, aside from referring people to various services, what do you recommend as the balance?
well, I certainly recommend the process that you follow, not meeting more than once or twice with an individual before you refer them. Now, you know, I know pastors that serve in rural areas find it more difficult to
Mm.
find a place to refer people to.
Yes.
But I still remember I was doing my training at Des Moines Pastoral Counseling Center. He made a comment one day. He says, "Well, you know, these pastors come to me and think they're going to take a class or two, and then I'll be ready to be a therapist." And I was thinking, well, I was kind of thinking that myself.
Yeah.
But his point, which is well taken. Um, it's an entirely different skill. For one thing, you got to learn how to deal with transference and countertransference And particularly when you're in a pastor, you're an authority figure for the people you're meeting with. I mean, those transfers can get very heavy in terms of how they view you. Plus the fact you're going to continue to see them. So how much do they really want to share with you? How much do they really want to be honest with you? You know, all those are reasons that even though you're skilled, you shouldn't be operating as a therapist for people of your congregation.
Yes.
So then you need to develop a good referral source somehow.
Absolutely. So yes, and preaching to the choir, but actually that's exactly what I was thinking. And one thing I tell usually a couple or a family is very simply, you don't want me to be your couples therapist, your family counselor, because I may be preaching a sermon one day, and you're like, is he talking about us? Is he
Yeah,
telling them our story?
no, exactly, exactly. Right. You know, and every time they see you, they go, "Oh my gosh, he knows that." You know,
That's right. Well, in closing, let me tell the viewers that you have a great sense of humor, and we were joking in our email correspondence about what to call each other, and I think we settled on Tom and Roger, which is the way we American pastors tend to be. But my joke is always when people say, "Should I call you Reverend or Doctor or whatever?" I usually jokingly say, the right or Your Lord Highness will do." And then you responded with Right Reverend and Left Reverend, which I enjoyed and made me think of the Twix commercial where you have the left Twix and the right Twix. And so uh, it's good to have a sense of humor. It makes I think it's should be one of the beatitudes of ministry anyway.
you're on the left side of my screen, so you're the left reverend today.
Well, I am definitely uh, probably worthy of that. So, but maybe as opposed to right Reverend, it should be the wrong Reverend, just as equally. So. Well, I'm very grateful to you for this time and for your wisdom. I'm especially grateful. Well, no, I'm especially grateful for that, but I'm also grateful for your book, which has been a blessing to me. And I know that if others will pick it up and read it, that they also will be blessed by it. And so thank you for your ministry and thank you for your time.
Thank you for your care of other pastors. It's so important.
Amen. Thank you. All righty. Well, I'm going to hit the stop button now and
All right.
again.